Welcome to Noon Wednesday. I'm Marissa Wojcik, multimedia journalist with Here and Now on PBS Wisconsin. Today is February 16. Milwaukee will soon see a new mayor for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Of the 7 candidates who ran in yesterday's primary election, Acting Mayor Cavalier Chevy Johnson and Alderman Bob Donovan will advance in the general election in April. Joining me to break down the candidates, the issues, and Tuesday's primary results are John Johnson, a research fellow at Marquette Law School, and Wisconsin Public Radio reporter Christine Hatfield. And thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you
So
indeed.
Christine, I want to start with you. Can you give us an overview of the biggest issues that were in front of the candidates?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole gauntlet of them to run, which kind of comes with the territory of a city the size of Milwaukee. So, I mean, there's reckless driving and its causes. There's the increased rates of car thefts in the city. There were more than 10,000 of them last year. And then there's the matters of crime and public safety in general, and the city's relationship with the police, especially when it comes to keeping police around. In another silo, you've got the future of Milwaukee Public Schools and its funding. Then there's the city's pension challenges and what that can mean for budgeting for services as we go down the line. And then, for that matter, ways to just bring revenue into the city. Part of that conversation is kind of reliant upon the relationship with state government and Madison and the legislature especially. Then there's the matter of housing affordability, the racial gap in housing ownership, all of those topics just predicated on making sure people have a roof over their heads. And then I guess the question at the very root of all this is almost a sort of existential question, especially after all these years with the same governor, not the same governor, the same mayor. What makes Milwaukee what it is, and how does the mayor help make a city that's safe, healthy, and successful? So that's really what's at play here in a nutshell.
So lots of varying interests, and from what I understand from John, that plays out in your data. So John, after last night's results, seeing Johnson and Donovan coming out on top, outperforming even State Senator Lena Taylor and others, what stood out to you about these 2 candidates that came out on top?
The most striking thing to me was how broad Cavalier Johnson's support was. He won 12 out of the city's 15 aldermanic districts. He had strong support across his own aldermanic district and neighboring areas on the north side, which he represents. But he also did very well on the east side of Milwaukee and in Bayview, areas that were bastions of support for former Mayor Tom Barrett. I was also struck by Donovan's performance, but not how strong it was. He actually did quite a bit worse than he did in 2016. In 2016's primary, he got about 1/3 of the vote, and this time he got just a little bit over 1/5. So the only reason Donovan advanced is because the remainder of the electorate, about 35%, was evenly divided between State Senator Lena Taylor, Sheriff Ernell Lucas, and Alderwoman Mariana Dmitrievich. So Donovan is advancing to the second round, yes, but not from a position of strength.
And Milwaukee is grappling currently with very historic rates of violence. Christine, how did this topic shape the race, and what were the positions of these top 2 frontrunners?
I mean, to some extent, we did talk a little bit about reckless driving, and there's the question there of how do you keep the roads safe for pedestrians, drivers, all the people who use those roads in one way or another. But things like homicides and murders, they're no less significant of an issue. There's been 31 homicides in Milwaukee already this year. Compare that to 2021. At this point in the year, there was only 14 homicides. So as best as we can tell, the problem really isn't diminishing. As for what Johnson and Donovan had to say about it all, well, Johnson has taken full advantage of holding the mayor's seat in the interim position. He announced a public safety plan not long after he took that position. And a lot of that plan is dependent on education, both for police officers and the public. keeping officers around in the police department, just funding for traffic enforcement and substance abuse prevention programs, that sort of thing. Donovan's talked some about restoring MPD to its former level of manpower, so there's that matter. And then I guess you could say Donovan's position is that there's been an attitude of lawlessness that's become pervasive in parts of Milwaukee. This is paraphrasing from the forum that we had here in Milwaukee last week. And that there just needs to be accountability for crimes committed. So harsher punishment, and then working with district attorneys, judges, and so on. And so, I mean, there's some commonalities in how Johnson and Donovan are going about this, but where Johnson's taking the address the root of the issue approach, I'd say Donovan's taking a bit more of a tough on crime stance.
And Milwaukee is very well known for its racial segregation and for having some of the highest rates of it in the country. John, you've written about Milwaukee's historically polarized electorate. What did you mean by that? And did you see that in Tuesday's primary results?
That's a great question. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go back to the last time Milwaukee had an open mayoral election in 2004. At that time, there's some parallels to today. At that time, we had a Black acting mayor named Marvin Pratt, and he ran against a wide field in the primary. He took first place in the primary. Tom Barrett came second, and then Tom Barrett really consolidated the white vote in the city and defeated Marvin Pratt in the general election. That's one of the most racially polarized election results I have ever personally looked at. If you make just a simple regression model where you use coefficients for each ward based on the proportion of racial and ethnic groups there, just those variables alone explain 98% of Tom Barrett's vote share. It's really quite shocking. After that election, Barrett went on to change and grow his coalition in real ways. His base of support was really in the majority white progressive neighborhoods in the city along the lake, as well as his own neighborhood of Washington Heights on the west side. From that base, which covers about a quarter of the city, when he ran against a conservative candidate like Bob Donovan or Tony Zielinski, he would get the support of the majority Black north side of the city as well. When he ran against a Black candidate like Marvin Pratt or Lena Taylor, he would get the support of the conservative white parts of the city, which are like Bob Donovan's stronghold. So with those sets of coalitions in mind, I was curious to see what this election would result in. And instead, we saw something rather new. Cavalier Johnson, who of course represents the 2nd district on the north side of Milwaukee, actually won quite considerable plurality of the vote in those parts of the city that Barrett had his greatest strength in, the east side of Highway or Interstate 43, and also the Washington Heights neighborhood on the west side. So this was, in some ways, one of the less racially polarized elections we've seen recently in Milwaukee.
And so also of major debate, not only in the city of Milwaukee itself, but expanding out something that state lawmakers quite often debate as well is Milwaukee public schools. So Christine, how did the issues of schools play out? And will we continue to see this come up for both of the candidates in the general election?
Right. I mean, as you mentioned, it's an issue that sort of transcends the city boundaries. I mean, one of my colleagues, I'll offer a shout out to Maddie Fox. At this very moment, she's working on a story about a state legislature proposal that would split up Milwaukee public schools. And that was certainly on the minds of the candidates at the forum last week. The moderators actually outright asked all the candidates at one point, do any of you support that proposal? Not a single one of them raised their hands, which I think speaks some to that really divide between the perspective of state government, the legislature for that matter on this, and where the people who are actually in the city working on these issues here stand on it. And I think that goes back some to the issue of, well, how do you work with state government to make sure, one, the schools are getting the funding they need so that teachers can make a living, so that marginalized groups that we don't really see much in teaching are more equitably represented, so students can get a relevant, up-to-date education that fits in that modern context. Donovan wants to make sure the private schools aren't left out of the conversation either. Johnson, meanwhile, is focused a bit more on getting education started in early childhood, just to make sure those foundations are in place from the get-go. And of course, you could go on and on and on about this issue. Is it going to come up in the general? I don't see why not. Maybe it's not quite as prominent an issue as violence and the like, but this is the sort of thing that affects the generations to come. And with the legislature setting their sights on breaking up MPS, there's another existential question. How do you deal with that if you are going to deal with that? And how do you reckon with the matter of making sure you're getting the funding you need?
Now, John, you've gone back, as you just spoke to, looking at the voting patterns of elections for Mayor Tom Barrett and how he's won throughout the years. But more recently, you also looked at county executive elections and how that might be speaking to what the current moment is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the 2020 county executive race was a very interesting one. The general election pitted David Crowley, who's a state assemblyman, against Chris Larson, who's a state senator from Milwaukee. Both Democrats, but Larson is an outspoken progressive, and Crowley, while certainly no conservative, I guess was perceived as more in the moderate track in that race. David Crowley is Black, Chris Larson is white. Chris Larson won those parts of the city which have supported Tom Barrett overwhelmingly, the parts by the lake and whatnot. Crowley won the majority Black parts of the city, but he also did surprisingly well in the more conservative parts of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County. Although he lost the far south and southwest side, he did so by less. He got more of the vote than he did on the more progressive east side of the city. Crowley also narrowly won Milwaukee County's most conservative suburb of Franklin, while losing its most progressive suburb of Shorewood. You can see the pattern across these races. And so that showed, a possibly new coalition in Milwaukee politics that could be successful. But that's not what we saw in this mayoral election. In this primary, instead, it was the progressive parts of the city and along the lake and the districts on the north side of the city that really joined forces to give Cavalier Johnson this large plurality in the primary.
Now, Christine, not personally being a resident of Milwaukee, I wouldn't have guessed something like reckless driving would be a top issue. So why are certain issues getting attention? And as John just spoke to, how is race a factor in the issues that people care about? And overall, will people be turning to these same issues, do you think, in the general election?
Right. I mean, to come to the matter of reckless driving, it's almost kind of become a trope about Milwaukee in this last year or two. And I think part of that has to do with the car thefts and the record numbers of those that we're seeing. And a fair number of that has to do with Kia and Hyundai vehicles. It feels weird bringing certain makes of cars into this, but they've had some security issues with their cars in the last few years where certain model years are just so easy to break into and get up and running even without the key around. So what you'll end up with is young people, teenagers, at times even preteens, who will break into these cars, take them for a joyride, and then just leave them stranded on the side of the road because these kids just don't really have the support systems that they need, especially in these more marginalized areas of the city. I mean, but that's not the only issue at play here. I mean, we could go on and on about the car thefts, but there's also just the matter of, do people know what they're doing when they're driving? And is there equitable access to driver's education in Milwaukee, especially with those more marginalized groups, as you were speaking to a little bit? I mean, many of the driver's ed programs that exist right now in Milwaukee are either limited in capacity or just plain unaffordable. I mean, Johnson's one of a number of candidates who's called for universal driver's education in MPS, and he actually not long before he took over the interim mayorship, he unveiled a plan to tackle the issue, whether with increased police enforcement, technology, altered street design, and so on. And then you've got Donovan going along with the idea of stepping up enforcement. At the forum, he talked about that lack of accountability around consequences for people who commit crimes. Though at that point, I think you're getting into a whole different can of worms in those issues with, well, how does the community connect with the police, and would that risk straining that relationship even more than it's already strained? Are these issues going to go away in the general? I think it would be naive to assume they would. I mean, these aren't going away. I mean, in these sorts of campaigns, you see people tending to gravitate toward those issues that hit close to home. And when it comes to things like reckless driving in a city that's so reliant on people using the roads to get around, it affects, if not most people's lives, then certainly it affects a lot of people's lives in one way or another.
And John, a part of your research has been looking at how the city's demographics have been changing and how that's been impacting the election. What have those changing demographics looked like? Is your data showing anything about how that's influencing the issues and how candidates are talking about the issues? And what are you going to be looking for as we head into the general election in April?
Yeah, in 2005 or 2004, when Barrett won his first election, probably a majority of the city's adults at that time were still non-Hispanic white. That's not true anymore. Milwaukee is a very diverse city, segregated, yes, but also diverse. And so if you're going to win a citywide race today, you need a multiracial coalition to do so. That was not necessarily the case 2 decades ago. And so it'll be a real challenge for Donovan, based on his past election results, to achieve that. I was doing some research on the last time Donovan ran in 2016. And in that primary, there was Tom Barrett, Bob Donovan, and then Joe Davis and aldermen from actually Cavalier Johnson's current district, the second district. And as I said, Donovan got about a third of the vote. As I recall, Joe Davis got 18%. And Joe Davis actually endorsed Bob Donovan after losing the primary. It didn't appear to make a whit of difference to the voters in his district who supported Barrett overwhelmingly in the general election. But I think that speaks to Donovan's real struggle to build any kind of appeal outside of his base of support in the 11th and 13th aldermanic districts on the far south and southwest sides of the city. And in fact, he did worse in those districts now than he did 6 years ago. So it's a real question of if he can find any way to appeal to more voters than he already has.
And with so many things changing in the city, as Christine spoke to at the start of the program, it's going to look like the identity of the city is going to change with this mayoral change. So we will leave it there. Christine Hatfield of Wisconsin Public Radio and John Johnson of the Marquette Law School, thank you both so much for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more from Here and Now and PBS Wisconsin, you can visit pbswisconsin.org/news. And before we go, Noon Wednesday is going to be taking a brief break. Check the space for updates, and we'll be back soon with more newsmaker conversations. But until then, I'm Marissa Wojcik. Thank you for watching.